Welcome to Parents Tool Talk Radio with your host, Jody Johnston Powell, licensed social worker, certified family life educator, second-generation parent educator, and author of the award-winning book, The Parents Tool Shop, the universal blueprint for building a healthy family. For over 25 years, Jody has been training parents and family service professionals nationwide and serving as a parenting expert to the media worldwide. Now, through the Parents Tool Talk show, Jody shares her practical advice and introduces you to other experts who can give you proven, effective advice on the issues that matter most to parents. So get ready to be informed, entertained, and enlightened as we join Jody now.
All right. Hi, everybody. I believe we started the recording, and today we are going to be talking about how to talk to children about violent events. Let me just start by saying a couple of things. First of all, I live near Dayton, and probably a lot of folks who do come on to this call live today may be from that area. This will date the recording of this, but last week, almost exactly a week ago, this is on, we had a mass shooting here in the Dayton, Ohio area, and I was connected to 4 of the victims. 3 of them were trainers at the Maple Tree Cancer Alliance, where I'm a patient, and 1 of them graduated a year after my daughter here in our local suburb. I'm about 10 minutes away. I've obviously, as a parent, have been concerned about whether it's school shootings or right before that, within 13 hours before that, was a mass shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, who, you know, parents shopping there with their kids. And I think it was less than a week, within several days before that, there was a family festival, which is something that, you know, we go to all the time with our kids and now our grandkids. I have grown kids now who would have been old enough to be at the Oregon District. And actually my trainer didn't happen to be one of the trainers who was there celebrating the dream job that one of the trainers at the Maple Tree Cancer Alliance had gotten. So, you know, when it hits home, and it really hits closer to home, it becomes more real. Not that it hasn't been real, not that we haven't been concerned about stuff before. But what I really wanted to do today was to really just kind of put politics aside, because politics can take a long time for solutions to come. And today what I really wanted to do is to just provide an opportunity for parents to come together and to talk as parents, to kind of put politics aside and talk about what has this been like, how do we handle these situations in terms of talking to our kids about them. What I'd like to do is to just do any kind of a check-in for folks who are on live, and it's up to you whether or not you want to speak up or if you want to put something in the chat, just to give you kind of a chance to check in and share with me what you would like to get out of this hour that we have together. I have prepared a presentation. There's a couple of resources that I found that I thought were really good, and so I can share those with you. And then I also just want to have some time where I turn off the recording and we just get a chance to talk with each other as parents privately about our kids and our fears or whatever. All I ask is that we kind of put political aside, and that we just meet today as human beings who are parents, who are concerned, and that we will talk more about trauma, the effects of trauma next week, and we'll also talk about some solutions, and not that we can't talk about those today, but I do have special time set aside for that. So having given my introduction, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jody Johnston Powell, author of The Parents Tool Shop. I'm a licensed social worker, certified family life educator. So let me just see if anybody wants to, you can unmute yourself if you want to speak up or if you want to check in into the chat room. And if you would, if you're here live, just share what it is that you would like to get out of this time together. I think what folks are wanting then is to get information. So let me go ahead and share with you a couple of things. So first, I did find, and let me start to share some of my screens. Hold on, so actually there were some, the Dayton Daily News had some suggestions for how to talk to your kids about the recent shooting. I have a lot more ideas than that. Everything that they shared, though, I would probably say is also in my presentation. And then also, I looked at quite a few, actually, tips for how to talk to children. One of the ones that I thought was the most thorough was on ABC. Regardless of, I don't know, whatever stations anybody watches, but they had a couple of therapists on here. And so I may show this a little bit later on, but actually some of the suggestions that they had also are included in my presentation. So why don't I go ahead and do that presentation. So in pulling together this information, I kind of wanted to start kind of at the beginning. We all may have children who are of different ages. Obviously, you have really young children. It's going to be different than if you have school-age, teenagers, or adult children. And we're going to talk more about the older kids and adult children next week, particularly around reducing the risks and some actions that we can take. But let's just talk about, when news hits, how do you handle this, with kids? And so really kind of the first question is, how do kids find out about the news? If you have really young children, chances are they're either going to see it playing or hear it, overhear it while you're consuming the news somehow, or they're going to overhear you talking about it with other people. If they're in school, certainly if they're teens, where they may be actually presented with the information, it could be at school actually as a discussion, it could be online if they have access to online, it could be from their friends. So the first thing to do is to kind of find out, how did they find out, or how are they finding out, or think about how you want them to find out. Ideally, it would really be best for it to come from you, but that isn't always possible. So if they seem to already know about what's happening, you actually want to find out, what have you heard? Ask open-ended questions like, well, what have you heard? And see what they say. Kind of put it into context, correct anything that is maybe incorrect. If they're, extremely upset about something, we're going to talk about how to minimize their stress here in just a couple of steps. I think a bigger question, or even before that, is, should children know about the news? And, unless you're going to keep your child in a bubble and have them not interact with the world, the answer is generally yes. Obviously, the older they are, the more important it is to know about current events and to use those events to discuss sometimes difficult topics, and not so much in a way that we're lecturing it, or that maybe we're ranting and raving about, what's happening, and they overhear that, but that we actually use it to ask open-ended questions to get them to think critically about things. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit as to why that is so important. Generally speaking, unless a child's under 5 years old, you can allow them to watch news and then discuss it. I really want to say a caveat, though, to avoiding, like, when this kind of stuff happens, there's like 24-hour, 7-day-a-week coverage, and that can really be traumatizing, because especially if it's TV where they're showing visual or talking about it over and over and over, and you're not getting a break. I think a lot of us can remember 9/11 and how much that was on, and there just came a point where on the one hand you couldn't pull yourself away and you're in shock, yet on the other hand, for a lot of people there came a point where it was like they had to step away and do something normal because it was just becoming traumatic. It was traumatizing them to continue to consume that. So that's the piece that we really want to be careful about with children, because especially 0 to 6, children don't really have filters, and they don't have the cognitive ability to process that kind of information. Everything gets directly downloaded, and about the only filters that they have are developmental. So let's say you have a child who's egocentric, where the world revolves around them. Somehow or another, they will perceive, or they will filter whatever that information is in relation to how it affects them, or how it somehow has to do with them. Maybe even their fault, or whatever. Maybe not so much news that happens in the community, but that is very common for whatever children experience from 0 to 6, that they have a difficult time filtering and processing it. And you can't really discuss it usually with younger kids. So that would be the caveat on that. In terms of what's the best medium for children to consume news, actually, as rare as it is, radio is probably the least traumatic. It's only auditory, so there aren't visuals for them to kind of get sensory overload with the trauma. People are often talking about it or reporting it, and so it's less likely that somebody would kind of be experiencing it. And that's the thing about TV and online video is that by watching it, you almost experience it. And when you experience it, it can be more traumatizing. So newspapers would probably be next. They might even be less. I don't know. Radio, newspapers, either one could kind of be interchangeable. What's good about newspapers is that you can control, like you could just read the headline if you want, or you could start to read it and skip over something, or if something's upsetting you, you can close it or turn the paper. You have more control. With radio, you can't pause, you can't rewind. So that's where, as much as newspapers or online, I guess, would probably be a similar thing, except be really careful about the videos. Again, TV and online video are probably the most traumatizing, not only because you experience it, but because they keep replaying things over and over and again. So that's what you want to be careful of if you are going to allow your kids to, both for yourself to be less traumatized and your kids, maybe cutting out an article or saying, hey, did you see this? And then starting a discussion about that. So how do you discuss the news? The real key here is to ask open-ended questions. If they're really upset about something, try to put it in perspective. There's an old saying about the news, if it bleeds, it leads. And so the news does tend to focus on most of the negative things happening in the world. The bloodier and the more sensational, the more press it tends to get. And so that can give the impression that these things happen more often than they do. And because the news comes right to our door, it can appear as though it's happening right in our own community, even when it's not. When it is, such as the mass shooting here in Dayton, having it be so close really does make it extra scary. So you kind of want to just, find out what facts they already know, clarify the facts, which we already covered, and then just discuss, ask open-ended questions like, what do you think about that? Or depending upon, what piece of the information it is, ask those open-ended questions. You want to kind of avoid pressuring them to talk, or certainly avoid pressuring them to agree with you. Certain news things, especially a lot of what in the past, what didn't necessarily have a political connection. It seems like almost everything in the news these days has some kind of political connection. The older your children are, the more important it is for them to be allowed to have opinions that aren't exactly identical to yours. And I'll tell you why. The number one thing, well, first of all, it's good because it develops critical thinking skills. Critical thinking skills are the part of the brain that's in the frontal cortex. This is the part of the brain that when something happens, it slows down, and instead of making an impulsive decision, says, wait a minute, consider the options that you have, and then makes a decision based upon weighing out pros and cons and coming up with their own decision. When we encourage them to just kind of blindly, we as adults sometimes rant and rave, and we get into discussions with others who usually agree, or if somebody disagrees, sometimes parents aren't always real careful about what they say around their kids, name calling somebody, or, that person is a such and such, and, well, they don't know what they're talking about. Be careful about those kinds of statements which imply that everybody has to always agree about everything. One of the things that people who, and this is, we're going to talk about this in our trauma-informed conversation next week, about how kids into young adults get drawn into these videos and manifestos and things like that that kind of convert them. How is it that they kind of get their hooks into them? One of the things that actually increases the risk of your child being able to be manipulated or drawn into is a belief that everybody has to agree on everything. And so if they are basically kind of conditioned that we all agree, and anyone who doesn't agree with us, like, not only are they wrong, but like there's something wrong with them, and so there's something wrong with you if we don't all agree. Like that kind of way of thinking actually increases the risk that children could then be more manipulated by people who are looking for children and young adults who can be converted without critically thinking about what it is they're being told. They're not going to be presented with something and go, oh, I'm not going to take that at face value. I'm going to go research that. those are the people who are going to research it, and they're going to find, well, maybe there isn't any truth to that, and they're going to come to their own decision. They're going to be more internally strong in terms of having a stronger self-esteem. So be careful about that. Like it can be hard as your kids get older that they start to have differing opinions than you. So we just need to recognize, first of all, just because they have an opinion today doesn't mean that's the same opinion they'll have tomorrow or when they're adults. Part of the individuation process is that they are learning to be their own adults and to think for themselves. And this is a really good thing. Like, we want them to be thinking for themselves. So that's something else, to really kind of encourage them to do additional research. If they do have an opinion that concerns you, find out what is the basis for that opinion and how have they researched that? Where did they come up with that? And is this something that maybe there's more information about that they could make a more educated decision about? Research or something like that. If you are upset about the news, you do need to be careful. There's always a balancing, what's the word I want to say? Always want to come into the balance zone when it comes to parenting. So if you're upset, and it's okay for you to cry in front of your kids, it's okay for you to be upset around your kids. What you want to be careful of, though, is that if you're like really kind of hysterical over something, or you're just kind of sitting there staring, at the TV and you can't seem to pull yourself away, and your kids, you're not paying attention to your kids, like those are the times when you need to bring yourself into the balance zone again and kind of unplug yourself, take a deep breath and calm down. What's good is if you can do this in a way that models it for your children. I turn my video back on so that you can kind of demonstrate of taking in one of those deep cleansing breaths that helps reduce, it gets the oxygen back to your brain, it reduces your pulse and your blood pressure, and it's a really great stress management kind of a breath where if you put your hand on your stomach and you breathe in for 3, not up here in your chest, but down in your diaphragm, you breathe in for 3, hold for 3, or 4, and then gently exhale, 1, 2, 3. If you just take a couple of breaths like that, it can help reduce your stress. It can help your brain get back online. If you are really upset, you can be upset but be in control. And I don't mean control your emotions that you don't show them. It is important that you show your emotions. It's really important that you show that you care. It's, that you have compassion. These are all things that are really important. And having empathy, having compassion is, your child, if they have those qualities, are going to be less likely to be a part of the problem and become a part of the solution, right? And to be there and to help people and be there and to be more resilient because you'll be there for them. So again, kind of be careful be aware of the little sponges that might be in the room. And if you have older kids, of kind of involving them in more of a discussion. If you're just really, really angry about something, I think a lot of parents have long before these incidences have gotten to a point of being fed up and angry, especially, parents who have children who are in school and school shootings continue to happen. And, you don't necessarily want to have your kids live in a bubble. Maybe homeschooling isn't for you. And even if that is, that doesn't necessarily mean that your kids are safe. And, there's other things, that's a whole other discussion. That isn't the answer to everything. So if you do feel like you have a lot of anger, and you just want to do something, channel that into a really constructive direction. And that's up to you. You can affect the change that you want to see, whether it is getting involved in something political or writing something or joining a group or speaking out or just, going to the Oregon district and, volunteering or whatever it is, giving blood. When you do something, when you have anger, if you can channel that, especially if you have physical anger, you're almost so angry, or upset that you're shaking. If you can physically do something to channel that energy in a constructive way, it can not only help reduce your anger, but it can help you feel like you're doing something. And I think one of the most frustrating emotions when a crisis happens is the feeling of being helpless and that you're not there and you can't do anything to help. And if you were, you could, you could if you would, or you would if you could. And so kind of, again, model effectively working through your emotions. communicate your emotions appropriately, feel your emotions, express your emotions, talk about your emotions, and this is how children will learn how to do the same also and not just keep things in. But yet again, you don't want to be way overboard, because if your kids think you've lost it, then they've got to keep it together to keep you together. And then you get into a role reversal. So you want to be the grown-up, mature adult, but you don't want to be so stoic that children think that there's something wrong with them if they have feelings or they're scared. So if you do have to deliver bad news, I'm going to go ahead and put my video away again. If you do have to deliver bad news, let's say you have to let a child know that someone has been killed, or it can be sudden, or it could be something that's coming up. Generally speaking, to deliver bad news, and the younger the child, of course, it's going to make a big difference, because they may not understand. But across the board, you want to always deliver eye-to-eye, face-to-face whenever possible. Usually, either the police will go to someone's house to talk to when they have to make notifications. They'll either go to the house, or they may ask the parents to come to the hospital, and they won't tell them till they're at the hospital, maybe that their loved one has passed. And that's because it's important for people to get that news in person. Sometimes it happens where people don't find out, until it's through the news, and that adds to the trauma and the shock of not knowing. And for a lot of us, I was certainly, I wasn't a next of kin, but when I found out that it was people that I knew that were killed, that in finding that out through the news, it's kind of like you have one level of shock and then you get another level of shock at that. And so the more those levels of shock can be minimized, the better. Try to keep your voice calm and gentle. Start with basic information that's an age appropriate. We often talk, I train foster parents for the state, and the second webinar that I offer every month is trauma-informed parenting. And it isn't just, it's targeting foster parents. It's kind of for foster parents so they can get their training hours, but it isn't just for foster parents, because there are those of us that have children who have a trauma history who aren't involved in the system at all. But sometimes horrible things have happened to them, or they may be, say, in foster care because something happened with their parents. And so talking to them about that can be challenging if what happened might be too much for a child that age to take in and process. So start with very simple language, very simple terms. Do be accurate. In other words, don't say somebody went to sleep when they're dead. Somebody died. If you believe in heaven, you can say they went to go to heaven, but also be careful about, saying things like, God needed an angel, or, with little kids, it's really amazing sometimes how they take something that adults might say to each other and interpret that in a way that's actually really scary for them. Like, could God just take me? Or, gee, can I go see my mom? If she's dead and however it was, she went to sleep. Oh, well, maybe if I, so just be careful, be accurate, talk basics, use age-appropriate language. Don't get into any really graphic details or anything that's really kind of unnecessary initially. As children get older and they become curious, they will probably have questions. When they ask questions, just answer the question that they asked. Don't volunteer a lot of extra information. Not every child needs to know everything. Even as adults, there are adults who have regretted finding their birth parents and understanding the circumstances of it. Some of them would have been a lot happier not to know. So, don't make an assumption that everybody wants to know all the graphic details, and all of that. The number one most important thing that you need to communicate to your kids is that you'll do everything you can to keep them safe, and that right now they are safe, they're secure, and that they're supported, and that you're there to support them. I think it's getting harder and harder, and you don't really want to make promises that you might not be able to keep. Like, I promise this will never happen to you, or I promise this is far away. kids remember promises. So we do need to be careful about making promises. But the number one most important factor in resilience, which is the ability to experience traumatic events and come out on the other side. We often, look at people who went through the same traumatic event, and some handle it really well and some don't. And it's like, well, what was the difference? And there's actually 7 C's of resilience. I can pull that up if you want. That's something that we've talked about on the Trauma-Informed Parents Tool Talk show, which is the other one that I do every month. But the number one most important factor in resilience is having a relationship, a close relationship with a supportive adult who's there for you. And that's what we need in times of trauma. We need people to come together and be there for each other. And this is one of the things that I love seeing about both Dayton and other places, is that people come out and they come together and they're there for each other. There are times where people lose a loved one and that's all they had. They don't have anybody else. Or they're just lost. And so being there for other people helps you channel your grief, and it's there to help others with theirs. So let's talk for a minute then about how children handle stress. And really this is all people. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the fight or flight, right? When you're under stress or something startles you, you've got fight, you've got flight. I think one of the things that has been really scary about the last week or so is just how fast so much can happen. In 30 seconds, for example, in Dayton, 9 people were killed in 30 seconds. And there was someone that they interviewed that talked about, he was a guy, and he was like, I have these macho fantasies about if anything like that happened, I'd tackle the guy or I'd do this. Or then he said, when it happened in real life, he said, I couldn't believe how slow I reacted. Your brain just doesn't anticipate those kinds of things happening. Your mind doesn't go there. And so when it happens, it can take a little bit of time to react. Our bodies are equipped for quick reaction. If you want to imagine, being hunters and gatherers, before pre-civilization that we live in now, of if you have to outrun something, the body is really only designed to take about 20 minutes of stress at a time. Anything longer than that, and it really starts to be more traumatizing. So the 2 main responses are fight or flight. You either stay and you fight, or you run away. But there's 2 more. Some of you may be familiar with freeze. Freeze is kind of like that deer in the headlights. It happens and you're so shocked you just kind of stand there and you don't react. If you don't dive for cover right away, then that could make you more vulnerable. And so it's just, it's kind of a stilling behavior of freeze. Maybe if I'm invisible, no one will hurt me. And there are those of us, I have an auditory processing disorder. It just always kind of takes me a little bit longer to respond, especially if something is emotionally overwhelming. I'm one of those people that somebody will say something to me and my jaw will just kind of drop, maybe even visibly. And I wish I was one of those people that had a quick comeback. I don't. Like, I'll think of it that night or the next day. I'll be like, oh, dang, I should have said this. I should have said that. Because my brain tends to go to freeze. But there is a 4th one. And this is something that we have seen more of lately, as we have seen people like Elizabeth Smart and others who were held in captivity for a while and survived because they had this 4th stress response, which is fawn. And fawn is being overly compliant. It's agreeing to do whatever just to stay alive. And so, if somebody might say, well, why, if they had you in public and you didn't run away, why is that? Well, I knew that, by the time I got away, he might catch me, and if I didn't get away with it, I'd get killed or whatever. And so there's this overly compliant attitude of, I'm going to do whatever it takes just so I can survive. And this can start right from second one. Somebody is kidnapped and they're put into a car, and all of a sudden they realize, oh boy, this is not good. They can immediately start trying to be compliant to reduce their risk of, calm the person down and try to reduce the risk of something bad happening to them. So not everything is fight or flight, I guess is the point here. And that sometimes when children especially, because we're really focusing on helping our kids here, when kids are in a situation where there's not only fire drills and tornado drills, but now there's active shooter drills. And I can remember people in great-grandparent generation, they had nuclear weapon drills in school and would hide under the desks. Those can be traumatic. I had my granddaughter over the other day, and at noon on Wednesdays, the first Wednesday of every month, they test the tornado siren. And the tornado siren started to go off, and I said, oh, it's the first Wednesday, they're testing the siren. And she looked at me and I said, that's the tornado siren. And she goes, oh, I didn't know a tornado was coming. And she got all upset and started freaking out. And where do I go? And I said, we go into the utility room. But then I realized she actually thought that it was a real tornado. So it was one of those, it happened so fast, that she got really stressed very quickly. So having those, it's good to have those drills, but it's also, we need to be aware that when kids are in situations where they don't feel safe, and these are situations that they're in multiple hours a day, that we need to do something to help them feel safe, because it really becomes, here, I'll go to the next slide. It really goes from positive stress to more tolerable or toxic stress the longer you're in it. So positive stress can be something like you're getting ready to run a race. And you're anxious or you're nervous or you're getting ready to give a talk or something like that, or you're pushing and pushing to get a project done or get a paper in. And that can be positive in that it kind of, the elevated heart rate and stress hormones can kind of give you that extra boost of energy that you can kind of channel to get things done. But if you were to continue at that pace for very long, that would then become a more negative kind of a stress. So if you're constantly never getting things done at work, or children, if they are constantly under pressure at school and then they come home and they're under stress at home, and, then this is no longer positive, then it starts to go, well, is it tolerable or is it toxic? Tolerable is more like an emergency where it's serious. It might be intense, but it's only temporary, and there's usually supportive relationships. So if you think about, for example, the shooting in the Oregon district and people who were there, that certainly wasn't positive stress. It was more of a tolerable where, in that moment, everybody hid, everybody dove for cover, and as soon as they realized they were safe, then they were jumping right away into helping other people. It was serious, it was temporary, and everybody was pitching in together. And so while it was stressful and it was traumatic, the fact that there were people there, that buffers the trauma and helps you be more resilient. Not that you're not going to have flashbacks or nightmares or any of those kinds of things. And I can actually recommend a technique for PTSD around that anybody can learn, and it's very simple to learn, even children can. So I will go ahead and share that slide with you today. The third kind is the kind of stress you really, tolerable stress you can't always avoid. If you happen to be somewhere and an emergency happens, then hopefully you have some support there. Or, kind of like you get through the situation, and then when you're done, that's when you fall apart, and hopefully you've got a support system that, you have your cry after you get through the emergency. Toxic stress is stress that's really prolonged. And so it's, and you usually don't have supportive relationships. So children who are in homes where there's high conflict marriages, domestic violence, child abuse, derisive parenting, which is just that negative, critical, nothing you ever do is right, super perfectionistic, those kinds that kind of add stress, and it's this prolonged stress, those can become toxic stress situations. And over time, it literally starts to have an effect on the body and creates what's called cellular memory of not just the trauma, but the stress. And so actually long-term physical disorders can, and diseases and illnesses and stuff can, when children or any adult are under a prolonged period of stress. The ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, I actually took the slide out. I probably should have left it in. There's a pyramid that they show. I thought we weren't going into trauma, but that shows that whenever you have adverse childhood experiences, the more of them you have, or even if they're not that severe, but they're prolonged. So say you have, I don't know, a sibling who's just constantly writing you, teasing. They're not physically harming you. They're not physically abusing, maybe not even emotionally abusive, but just constantly writing. Like that level of stress over time can actually create disease, and it can cause developmental gaps in development, because when children are having to process trauma, their brains and bodies are not able to focus on what they need to be focusing on, which are their developmental tasks. And so cumulatively, when children have the more adverse child experiences someone has had, the more likely they are to have developmental gaps, diseases or physiological problems. A lot of times they're more likely to have things like drug abuse, or other kinds of chemical dependency that's used to kind of numb their pain or to cope with their anxiety. Because if they didn't have coping skills, if they didn't have that resilience, they didn't have that support, and then all of those kind of cumulatively can lead to an advanced earlier dates of death at earlier ages. And so the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, if you want to go look that up, is really a very longitudinal study. It was done, I think, over in like 19 years or so, and it was like from 9 to 91-year-olds, and they rated the level of adverse experiences and were able to conclusively draw connections between what happens. And actually, I could show you guys, I have a free public video on YouTube about, it's called Stress-Free Parenting, but it talks about, I'll show you guys that before we go, and I'll put the link into the chat. Let me go ahead and go to this slide, which is the warning signs in children. So how do you know if your kids are under stress? If they're your birth children, and you know what their normal is, you know what they typically are like, it will be much easier to spot warning signs. Foster adoptive parents who have children maybe who were just placed with them, they might not know children as well. And the fact if they were just placed with them, that in and of itself, I'm pretty sure they're going to be stressed right then. The biggest thing is that if you look at this list, every single one of these has some word like a sudden, dramatic, uncharacteristic change, something that's unexplained, something that's more extreme than usual. So it can be wanting to go to school, how much they can concentrate in school, how their grades end up being, how their mood is, are they more irritable? And this isn't, and this is usually that you can't necessarily explain it through other things. For example, if you have a teenager who is already kind of going through hormonal changes, moodiness for them is probably more likely to be developmental. Now, if you know that something happened, well, then it's a little bit easier. But sometimes what will happen is that kids are under stress and they don't tell us. A trauma that most people don't consider a trauma is bullying. And even if it never comes to physically being bullied, the stress of that can be traumatic. And kids don't always talk about what's happening at school or if they're being bullied or whatever. And we're going to talk about bullying. I actually have I've already done webinars on bullying. If you want, I can point you to those. I'm going to be doing one a little bit later on this year about bullying in terms of children who already have a trauma history and how they tend to be more targeted for that. And bullying is one of the, in the next webinar I'm going to do around why some kids kill and what are the 4 factors that this since 1966, almost 60-year-long research project found in terms of shooters. And don't be thinking it can't be your kid. When you see what some of the factors are, these are kids that could come from very good parents, stable families. But when you get some of these kind of combining, then it can really create stress, and it can actually create a greater likelihood that they could end up acting out in a violent way. So we're going to take a look at that another time. Let me go ahead and share with you a technique that I find to be really helpful, not only for adults, but you can teach it to kids. It's called emotional freedom technique. It's kind of, if you're familiar with acupuncture, which uses meridian points, and the practitioner puts needles in those points, and it kind of, if there's energy that has been focused there as a result of a trauma, or, and again, if you think about physiological, I think the ACEs study found that like it was close to between 75 and 90% of physical ailments can be traced back to stress or adverse childhood experiences. So if you think about it that way, in terms of even if it's anything that has an emotional connection or even a physical ailment, that those meridian points, instead of using needles, you just tap on them. If you go to EFTuniverse.com, you can download the free manual that explains all the science behind it. It was created by Gary Craig. He was a minister, psychologist, and Stanford engineer. And it incorporates other trauma healing modalities such as EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprogramming. And so basically it's just a tapping technique that incorporates eye movements. Anybody can do it. You can tap on yourself. You can tap on a child. You can teach a child how to tap on themselves. If your child's talking to you about something traumatic or that they're upset about, if they just tap, here, let me take my, put my video back on. If they either tap, it's called the karate chop point. Like if you imagine you're karate chopping something, that part of your outside of your hand, if they just tap that while they're talking, or, you know, it could be, have you ever, whenever you're upset, have you ever caught yourself putting your hand on your chest and kind of patting there? One of the points is there. It's kind of at the bottom of the collarbone, of just encouraging tapping just while somebody's talking about something. And while they're talking about it, not only does it have physiological changes that sometimes you can feel, you can actually kind of feel yourself relaxing a little bit more, but it actually does something in terms of how that information is stored in the brain and in the body, so that you can have a memory of a trauma, but recalling it doesn't create a physiological like panic attack or flashback or some of those things. And so it's become, when Gary Craig retired, he allowed his teachings to just kind of go public domain. And so if you go on to YouTube and you type in EFT, you'll find all kinds of people, and they do it. It's not one of those you can only do it one certain way. So you're going to see a lot of variations to it, which is a good thing. Those of you who always want to do things the right way, there's no one right way of doing it. So if you're perfectionist, like, you got to get rid of that, because there's no one right way to do it. But if you kind of learn the basics of it, then it's something that you can do. You can do on your child, you can teach your child, you can make up a song whenever they're stressed that they can, you know, that they tap their happy points. I can walk through what they are real quick. You can also do it by proxy, and I didn't actually discover this, my aunt did. My aunt, I had a cousin who had cerebral palsy, and I was talking to and actually my uncle had a stroke, and I was telling my aunt about, I had discovered emotional freedom technique, and I was talking to her about it, and she researches everything. She's the most, you know, she researches everything both from a biblical perspective plus a scientific perspective. And anyway, she found out about EFT by proxy, which is she tapped on herself on behalf of my cousin. And that gets into a whole other level of science I'm not sure that anyone can explain yet. However, it is documented that it can be used this way, and my aunt did this. My cousin, she had cerebral palsy. She was in her 40s, and she was in a residential treatment facility because she needed round-the-clock care. And she ended up being raped while she was there. And so my aunt brought her home, but she wouldn't let anybody touch her. And she had to be touched because she needed to be cared for. And so when I told my aunt about this, and she read up on it and discovered the EFT by proxy, she tapped on herself with the intention of it helping my cousin. And she said within a week that she noticed a dramatic difference in her quality of life, her ability to let people approach her, eventually touch her. And I mean, it didn't cure her, you know, cerebral palsy or anything, but in terms of this emotional event that happened to her, it was a really dramatic change that she noticed. And so I'll just walk you through. Let me see, can I change how big my, and here, I don't know if I'm moving this. I don't know if it's really moving on the video or not. So that you can see the diagram, I think is off to one side, and I think I've moved to where you can see. But basically the tapping points are top of the head, which I don't think is listed on here, top of the head, top of the eyebrow here, outside the eye, under the eye, between the nose and the lip here, between the lip and the chin, and that little indentation I'd already mentioned, right, kind of where the collarbones come down, under the arm, each of the sides of the fingers, doesn't matter which side, which hand or anything, your karate chop. And then you close your hand into a fist, and right where you have these two knuckles, if you were to imagine a triangle from those two knuckles back on your hand, continue to tap there, and then you do the eye movements, which is close, open, down left, down right. You go clockwise all the way around, and then clockwise back all the way around. Hum the beginning of a song like Mary Had a Little Lamb, and then count to 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you can do the tapping one more time, and then that's it. Before you begin, actually what you do is you target something, you give it a rating of 0 to 10, and then you, it's not shown on here, you can do the karate chop point, or it's called a sore spot. And you say, even though I have this, whatever, it could be fear of heights, it could be whatever, panic attack, or I'm still upset about what Aunt Susie said to me. Even though I'm still upset about what Aunt Susie said to me, I totally, completely accept myself. You say that 3 times. Then you start the tapping. Anybody who wants, you can go and get it from EFT Universe. You can get the whole manual. If you guys want a handout that I use in my workshops, just here, I'll go to the last slide. Just let me go ahead and put this away. Just send a request to info@parentstoolshop.com. Just ask me for the EFT handout, and I'd be more than happy to send that to you. It's a PDF, and it'll walk you through the process. And let me go ahead and stop the share and come back and see if anybody has any questions or comments. Let me go ahead and share. I think you're seeing this. Let me go to the parents. Let me go to YouTube and go to the Parents Tool Shop. It's the Parents Tool Shop. Here, if you look up here, the Parents Tool Shop, all one word. And then let's see if I can. It is. Let me see if I can type it in here. It's called Trigger-Free Parenting. Here, Trigger-Free Parenting. It is about a 45-minute presentation. And here, I will put that link also into the chat. And this goes into a little bit more of how trigger buttons get programmed in, and how they create a cellular memory, and how you can deprogram them. So let me go ahead and go back. I'm going to stop the share, go back over to the chat. Let me toss this into the chat real quick. All right, there we go. All right, well, we will continue this topic. What I'm going to be covering a week from now, and this is usually for foster adoptive parents, but it's really for any parents, because any kid can have a trauma history. We are going to take a look at the 4 qualities of mass shooters, because there's some surprising information in there, that it isn't always mentally ill kids who are playing lots of video games. And it's really important for every parent to know, because there is something we can do. And if we do care about other people's kids and our community, there are things that we can do that could actually stop this without having to wait for politicians to change laws. So I will share that with you next time. I hope that someday that this webinar never needs to be seen, and that parents and children are not having to deal with such violence. And until then, I'm here to support you. We're here to support each other, and I appreciate you all for your time and your attention. So take care, everybody. Have a good day. Bye now.